Ralph, thank you for letting me follow Sasha. Not only did he have an incredibly informative presentation, but I feel like I need a therapist before I get on a plane to go back to the United States as a Republican. Guten Tag, good morning. It's a privilege to be with you here at the Adenauer Foundation. I was fortunate to work in the White House for the first President Bush. We affectionately refer to him as 41 because he was our 41st president. At the time the Berlin Wall fell, and I won't tell you how young I was at that time because you're all very good at data, and I don't want you to know my age. I'll leave you guessing. But it was incredibly moving as an American, particularly working in that environment, to see what was happening in Germany at the time. I think as Americans sometimes, because we're isolated geographically, by two oceans, we don't really have a sense of how tangible freedom and democracy are. And you do. Many of you may have been too young even. I know some were too young to even be here at the time the wall fell. I have a friend who I told I was going to Germany, and he said next to the birth of his two children, the fall of the Berlin Wall was the most significant event in his life. And I thought surely he had relatives or family in Germany. He must to make a statement that's significant, and he said no, that he was a college student in Paris at the time. And when they were watching the television and they saw something happening in Germany, like any good college student, instead of staying where it was arguably safe, they rented a car and rushed to Berlin to be a part of the celebration here. And he said, you know, in the US, freedom is just not as tangible as it was at that point, at that time, in this place. And so I think we're so focused on data and strategy and the how we win campaigns and what we do to win campaigns, it's appropriate to take 30 seconds and think about why we do what we do. And the Adenauer Foundation is certainly at the forefront in Germany and in Europe and in fact around the world in promoting democracy and freedom. And so it is a special privilege for me to be here with you. With that, I think the rebuilding of Germany is an appropriate segue to what must happen for my political party, as you've just heard. What's been accomplished here is actually a powerful reminder of the enormous opportunities that are created when outmoded ways of thinking are swept away. There was a time when the Republican Party, and you referenced Karl Rove, was really the leader in the use of data, and I think we got complacent. And so I would give you a quick warning that as the party in power in Germany, you must be very careful not to do what we did, not to duplicate our mistakes in that regard. In the US, I need to remind you that our political parties are essentially machines. So unlike in Europe, they're designed simply to distribute content and deliver messaging. And there are two major challenges that are facing the Republican Party right now. One is related to ideas. This is where the art of campaigning comes in and substantive policy reform. The other to the mechanical aspect of campaigns, data, messaging, voter contact. I'm going to focus in my presentation today on mechanics because you are pros at political communication. But I'm happy to talk about what arguably is a bigger issue for the party, which is content and ideas, and is the Q factor, the unknown in what happens with the examples that Sasha gave you. There is something we can't control, which is messaging and content, and it's very important. So to begin, you're all statisticians and mathematicians. I want you to solve a riddle for me. Hopefully after Sasha's presentation, you will get this correct. Who would be most likely to win? Me, an amateur tennis player in a match against your great Steffi Graf. I assume she's a good example to use, although someone told me recently she's only back in Germany to do coffee advertisements now. She's become quite a capitalist in the US. So me playing Steffi Graf at tennis, or a political party that is fighting demographic changes. And the answer, of course, is you should bet on me to beat Steffi Graf, even though you have no idea what type of tennis player I am. If I played tennis with her, I would have perhaps a 1 in a million chance of beating her, or even being able to return a serve against her. But if a political party is running against demographic trends, it has absolutely no chance of winning, period. And as you will see, Republicans, unfortunately, are fighting and competing against demographics right now. So let me begin with a little background, which I think you know, on the US presidential election. The basics are obviously that Obama won the latest election, his re-elect with 51% of the vote to 48% of the vote. Electoral votes obviously reflective of the way in which we count votes. Different states have different numbers of electoral votes. But I think what's important to see are the demographics beneath the numbers. I'm going to start with the fact that Obama won women by 10 percentage points. That is significant because there were 7.7 million more female voters in the U.S. election in 2012 than male voters. 7.7 million more women. Obama won younger voters, as you'll see, age 18 to 29 by 23 points. That is a growing segment of the electorate and a problem for Republicans as our voters tend to be older. I mean, just to put it bluntly, we're dying. This is a real challenge for our party. They are getting the younger voters. African Americans, of course, by 87 points, no surprise there. Hispanic voters for 47 points. I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a minute. This is perhaps the biggest demographic group, which gives us the greatest opportunity in 2014 and 2016. And Asian Americans by 47 points, which is really troubling to Republicans because we tend to be the party that is perceived as a party of family and family values and hard work and ethics and focus. And these voters should be Republican voters, but they were not with Obama. I want to start with the white vote, too. There is a trend here I want you to look at. The white vote is getting significantly smaller in the United States. In 1988, 87% of presidential voters were white. In 2012, only 72% of voters were white. President George H.W. Bush received 60% of white voters in the 1988 election. Guess how many Mitt Romney received? 60%. But he still lost the election by 4 percentage points. That is a huge challenge for us. Let's go back to the female vote increasing in the United States. Women are, as I said, increasingly more likely to vote in U.S. elections. In fact, in every U.S. election since 1996, they have been more likely to vote. And they provided 53% of the electorate in the last election cycle. Let's look for a minute at ethnic minorities. Over the last 5 cycles, the share of voters who were racial or ethnic minorities went from 1 in 6 to 1 in 4. They are now 1/4 of the electorate in the United States. That's all ethnic minorities together. Let me focus for a minute on Hispanics. I said I would come back to this. In 1980, exit polls showed that 88% of the U.S. electorate was white. I mentioned it was 72% in 2012. Hispanics made up 7% of the electorate in 2000. 10% in 2012, and in 2050, according to the Pew Hispanic Center, Hispanics in America will grow to 29% of the electorate. That is not insignificant. Between 2008 and 2012, the number of eligible Hispanic voters grew by 19% in America, from 19.5 million to 23.3 million. With fast-paced growth in every region of the U.S., frequently, because I'm in Florida, people expect the Hispanic population to be significant. If you are in Texas, a border state, if you were in New Jersey, there's always been a significant component of the electorate that are minority or Hispanics, but now we are seeing growth in every region of the U.S. This is a challenge. It's also an opportunity for our party. Skip over these. This just shows you the tremendous Democrat advantage with Hispanics going back to 1980 and Jimmy Carter, who took 56% of the vote, Bill Clinton and 72% of the Hispanic vote in 1996, Obama 71% of the Hispanic vote. If you add to that the national growth in what we in Florida call no major party voters or independents, and we are really seeing this in swing states in the United States, you have an increasingly complicated electoral puzzle for the minority party, which Sasha mentioned. When we look into the far future, we see the generation of young adults we call millennials with a deep distrust of both major political parties. And as we talked about yesterday, I found your presentations fascinating because we're seeing so many of the same things in the U.S. They believe in social network more than traditional social structures. So that's important to keep in mind. Growth of any political party is difficult to find in a country where it is hard to find voters who will tell you that they support the party more than the candidate. Sasha was correct, of course, that people's patterns tend to be repeated. If they vote Democrat in one election, they tend to duplicate that. They want to tell you that. If you go to a focus group in America, and I have seen this time and time again, where we will pull a sampling of voters into a room, let's say 30 voters, and we'll ask them their opinions. I know their background, I know their history. I know that they, and if we're looking at a primary electorate, we're trying to learn about that. They tend to be Republican, they voted straight party ticket. I know a lot about them. But the first question you ask is, do you vote for the party or the candidate? And they will beat each other up to tell you that they vote for the candidate before they vote for a political party. I'm not sure if it's something about the culture in America that we like to think of ourselves as independent even when we're not, but there is a growth in the independent vote. So Republicans have obviously grown increasingly frustrated. In fact, last night I read that one of your presenters at your last conference, or maybe in 2010, was the lessons of losing campaigns. I'm here again to talk about the lessons of losing campaigns. In December of 2012, I received a call from Reince Priebus, who's the chairman of the Republican National Committee, our national committee structure, indicating that we had to do something about this. That's obvious. He had decided to conduct an audit, a review of our most recent loss, and this was a little unique. His intent was to stem the tide going forward. And while the political party was not directly responsible for the loss, campaigns obviously take a preeminent role in a presidential election, with the party, as mentioned previously, as a support structure. He felt the party had to play a leadership role going forward. And he wanted a top-to-bottom review of all parts of our campaign effort, from fundraising to strategy to mechanics to outreach and engagement with minority groups, social media, use of paid advertising. So he asked me if I would serve as a co-chair of this audit with 4 other individuals. There were 2 women and 3 men. I guess you could argue after looking at that data there should have been 3 women and 2 men. Nevertheless, we moved forward, 1 Hispanic, 1 African American, a Jewish voter. The group had to be small by design and representative of our party geographically and demographically, and we called our effort the Growth and Opportunity Project. Our co-chairs began to meet in late December of 2012 to take a hard look at the previous election cycle, review lessons learned, and plan a path forward. And to do that, we held regular calls. We assigned a list of leadership to whom we would reach out. We held focus groups, conducted polling, participated in thousands of conversations with individuals and groups, held group meetings, conducted online surveys, worked furiously to gather feedback from all segments of our party at every level. And we also wanted to talk to independents and Democrats about their perceptions of our party, which was very important in order to build our effort. I cannot overstate, if you are considering an audit of the CDU, which I doubt that you are, but you should think about it. I cannot overstate the premium we placed on stakeholders feeling engaged and involved at every level. This was a very sensitive process to take this public of a look at our weaknesses, at our flaws. I think we actually tallied every conversation, every focus group, and we had talked to over 52,000 people individually by the time the report was actually complete. We divided the work into different sections, and I was assigned the topic of campaign mechanics to include things like voter contact, voter mobilization, research, and data. We also assigned the other 4 committee members sections of our report: fundraising, minority engagement, messaging. And we reviewed in the U.S. our primary nominating process, which is something you, I don't think, face here, but it was important to us to be able to better control things like debates and who ran our debates, what members of the media were moderating debates, along with our nominating schedule, which is sort of unique in that it gives tremendous power to smaller states like Iowa and New Hampshire. Well, obviously I could not do this by myself. We had 90 days. It was overwhelming. And so I pulled together a small group of campaign operatives that I trusted with expertise in everything from polling and survey research to communications and advertising. And we met with a tremendous number of people, as mentioned. One of the most interesting things we did from my perspective was to survey our own campaign professionals and party workers, consultants, on how they felt we compared to the Democrats. And you might guess they did not give us a good rating. What we learned was very discouraging. In the 2012 race, we had been beaten on every front from the perspective of campaign mechanics. We'd lost an advantage on data that I mentioned we had held for several cycles, and the Obama team was simply more sophisticated with the use of the information they had. But more importantly, Sasha mentioned this as well, they put a premium on something that should have been obvious to us, and that was the basics of in-person voter contact. We had moved away from this, but they realized that the world was becoming a much smaller place. And a personal contact from a friend, a colleague, a football coach who coached your children, in our case in soccer as we call it, someone that you work with, somebody your children attend school with, could make all the difference in a close race. We tend to think that's not a sophisticated approach. It paid off significantly for the Obama team. So our report was released in March of 2013, and it was considered by many to be highly critical of our party and our efforts in the 2012 cycle. In fact, many people said, why on earth are you making this public? There were points during the process I questioned that myself, but we did feel transparency was very important, and the report had to be constructively critical, but to be taken seriously, to be credible with voters and members of our own party, along with others, it had to be honest, and it had to be public. The recommendations were comprehensive, but they left flexibility basically for strategic innovation and execution and implementation. But what we saw about the Republican Party, to put it bluntly, was that the brand of the Republican Party was dead. And we had lost credibility with young voters due to stances on social issues that made us seem old and all white and all out of touch. What's interesting also is that Republicans at the state level in the 50 states in the U.S. actually have the opposite experience. They hold the majority of governor's seats in the U.S. The majority of state legislators are Republican, and we saw a party that was working much more effectively at the local level than the national level. So we took that into consideration with our recommendations and made it clear that we needed to learn from more successful leaders at the state level who were perhaps a little more pragmatic about what mattered to voters. We need to open our party to more voters, including those who share some, but not all, of our principles. We had lost the ability to be persuasive with people who did not look like us and did not agree with us on every issue. So we made some very specific recommendations. This was not a broad, flowery document that sat on a shelf. We came back with over 200 recommendations that fall into 4 categories. We needed to greatly improve how we employ data across all campaign and party functions. We needed greater collaboration and sharing of data, which is something the Democrats did well. As Republicans, if we invent an idea, we tend to consider it proprietary, and we hold on to it, and then we want to sell it and make money off of it. The Democrats were always much more collaborative with their ideas and their tactics. We recommended revamping our data trust organization. Data trust is the national data center that is maintained by the Republican National Committee, and it holds the type of data that Sasha referenced, which is voting behavior and patterns of Republicans, where they live, any information we could append to the file that we've gotten from additional survey work. We also recommended revamping the technology office at the National Party Committee to recruit and hire a chief technology officer and to expand our digital and tech outreach. And a significant increase, and I can't say too much about this, a significant increase in candidate recruitment with a focus on females and minority candidates, particularly at the state level, to begin to build a bench of qualified women and minority candidates at the local level, which can run in the future. And we intentionally left policymaking to elected officials. To go back to what I mentioned originally, policy and ideas are very important in these contests. There was one area that we felt like was so important it had to be mentioned, and that was the area of immigration reform. We made that a clear point in our report. I think it is safe to see, if you've seen the data, we simply cannot ignore the growth in minority communities, particularly the Hispanic community, if we intend to ever be successful in a presidential race again. So how did we do? Well, hopefully Kristen will tell you a little bit of that when she gets up to speak. I'm not sure we'll fully know until after the U.S. election on November 4th, and then, to be honest, we won't have come full circle or even begun to come full circle until the next presidential election in November of 2016. Right now, signs point to a Republican takeover of the U.S. Senate, which would give us control of both branches of the U.S. Congress. But as mentioned previously, because this is not a presidential election year, voter turnout is expected to be much lower, and that will help more consistent voters. That will help the Republican Party. Democrats do tend to do better in presidential election cycles. What progress has there been to date, as of October of this year, on the audit recommendations, and what success stories can we share? So we've had some gains to talk about. Our most important recommendations, as I mentioned, centered around a few areas: engaging more voters with a positive message through a diverse field operation, modernizing data and digital capabilities to provide tools for state parties and campaigns, and updating our primary cycle. On voter engagement, we hired national and state-based staff to communicate directly with African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. The RNC has heeded that advice that we gave them, hiring professionals in the field. I think 91% of their political staff, the national political party staff, is now not in Washington, not in their headquarters where there are no Republican voters, but actually data directors and minority engagement staffers are now in all targeted 2014 states. On the data, digital, and technology fronts, there was no doubt that we had much work to be done, as mentioned, and the RNC has now made a multi-million-dollar investment in that area. They've hired a chief technology officer, a digital officer, a data officer, and they have begun to recruit from Silicon Valley, which was a real challenge for us. It's interesting to me because people involved in data tend to be more libertarian, which should be a natural fit for the Republican Party, but because of some of the stances we've taken on social issues or issues like immigration, they have shied away from the Republican Party. And so we have significantly increased our recruiting efforts to some success in that area. And finally, on the issue of the primary system, we did argue for changes to our primary process, fewer debates, an earlier national party convention, which will now happen. The RNC has taken action to make those recommendations a reality, but as said before, the work has only just begun. This was not a small undertaking. Our charge was to make recommendations for the long-term growth and health of our party, not for short-term, short-lived gains. And even as we evaluate the work that's going on, we recognize that there is much more to do. There are huge and continuing challenges for the GOP. The National Journal recently described what they call the existential battle for the soul of the GOP. That is very much in progress. It has not been solved. The Journal concluded that, quote, when one looks at the state of Republican public opinion, especially among likely caucus and primary voters, at the consistent and persistent messages coming from the information sources they follow, it is not at all likely that what passes for mainstream problem-solving conservatism will dominate the Republican Party anytime soon. But I'm ever the optimist. Crisis presents opportunity, as they say, and I'm hopeful that it also means change for my party. Many pragmatic conservatives have withstood primary challenges from Tea Party candidates this year. I assume you know of the Tea Party. This is the challenge within the Republican Party. Many of those candidates would have had difficulty succeeding in a general election, but we are nominating people who can win general elections this year, I'm pleased to say. There are leaders in our party nationally who, despite great political risk, have spoken out for immigration and education reform that could move our party in a new direction. And there is a new movement among elected conservatives in Washington to devise new policy solutions to help define our party moving forward. Just a quick preview of 2016. What does the future hold for us? Ultimately, we need strong national leadership for our party that can communicate in ways to drive new and different voters to our candidates. And that, as you know, is where the art comes in. To my earlier mention of content, ideas, and substantive policy change, our party must begin to lead on a way forward that brings new voters into our team. Tactics are only one part of this challenge and this process. We need a more hopeful, a more optimistic message. You remember yesterday our first speaker talking about emotion. Sometimes I feel like there is too much emotion in American politics. But people say Republicans speak from the head and Democrats speak from the heart. We are having to rethink speaking from the heart in the Republican Party. And only 2016 will tell us if we've actually been able to do this. The truth is this now for the Republican Party, both nationally and at the state level. There is only one goal for us if we're serious about this. It's to grow the party in order to start actually winning elections again. And the first step on the road to success is often understanding the challenges that you face and acknowledging your failure. We attempted to do that with our RNC audit. We scrubbed every facet of our loss, and now the RNC is developing effective strategies and tactics to correct the deficiencies we face. But the continued challenge, obviously, of a political party that is divided on many issues means that improvements in data and content delivery can only take us so far. There is still this very real disagreement among party members about the direction for the future, and the only thing that is going to bridge that divide is leadership. So what is the takeaway for the CDU and for other political parties abroad? I think I would say, as mentioned before, don't be complacent. Don't wait for a loss to take action. Begin the process of truth-telling now. That's not to imply a loss. I have no doubt you'll, let me be careful in the translation, but don't wait to take action. Our biggest achievement from the Growth and Opportunity Project may just be that the project was actually completed. For a major political party in the United States to be willing to open the curtains and provide an independent review team with the ability to seek feedback and tell the truth, and then publish that truth, was an achievement in itself. Most importantly, we were forced as a political party to ask ourselves those existential questions. Why are we here? What are we doing? Should we be doing it? Or should we be doing something else? Who else can help us? And what other entities does the party have, or should the party form that can assist in our goals? We were open to criticism, and we took our evaluation seriously, and I do believe that we're seeing change as a result and a path to the presidency in the future. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Happy to take any questions. Oh, thank you. I can get it, just drink it out of there, that's fine. Thank you, perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally, for the presentation. And the part you were saying earlier, you know, we can talk about more and more content, but I think it was like the underlining theme of your presentation, that it's very important to actually, you know, think about the policy and think about the issues we are addressing as a party. And I'm not just saying the Republicans, but also the Democrats, especially when you're in an environment where you see that the demographics are moving away from you, and you would naturally think, you know, there are the values we share, but still we are losing those demographics. To start with the simple question, I don't know, I'm not living in the US, I'm just like reading and seeing what's going on there, and I have the impression that a lot of times it's been one candidate to actually form the agenda of a party. I think it was Bill Clinton using the Governors Association to sort of rebrand the Democrats and then just like have some new issues on the table. Now it seems like the Republicans understood that it's not just like depending on the candidate running 2016, but to like maybe get all these candidates involved to get a new party. Is that how it's done, that we're actually going to see more of a process, like a primary over issues and content and then the candidate?
I would like to think that would be the case. I hope that will be the case. I mean, certainly data and voter contact and targeting is critical. We fell behind. I'm quite confident we can catch up. I mean, this is certainly doable on our part, and there are a lot of people who are doing this, so I feel good about that. But there is still this debate within the Republican Party about what we stand for. And I think the only thing that resolves that and helps us nominate someone who can actually be president and win is a real leader has to emerge from our field of candidates. And there are several people who could do it. There's several people here. There are people who I did not have a picture of here who could do that. It gives me hope that in the off-presidential year we are seeing pragmatic conservatives, but people who have actually had to lead and govern and compromise on some issues. They have been able to win primaries. Across the board, in the major challenges by Tea Party candidates, the Tea Party has not done what they did in 2010. And so, to me, that is encouraging. And that's not a criticism of the Tea Party per se. It's just as someone who works in campaigns, who has access to this data and looks at the future, we have no choice to still have wins and to have a political party that can elect a president. We have to move in a new direction. So.
I'm opening up for questions. There's the first.
Thank you. I imagine that playing catch-up on technical issues feels unrewarding. My question is, coming from Bavaria, where the CSU had a very strong base in party organization and a lot of local groups meeting and including new people, have you ever considered looking at the German or maybe other countries' systems of parties and slightly changing your party system to become more personal?
I think we have to. What that would involve in terms of party rules or structure would be very different from what you see in Europe, because again, the party is really, in the US, the parties are vehicles to raise money and to spend resources. Once we have a nominee, that nominee and his campaign or her campaign will clearly drive the agenda from our side, and the Republican National Committee will be used as a resource or a vehicle. But certainly, I think there are lessons, particularly at the state level, that we can take away. I'm from Florida. I've been in Florida 21 years, I think 22 years, and our party is one of the more successful state parties in dealing with some of these demographic changes, because the state of Florida is such a diverse state. It's such a bellwether state, and we don't just have Hispanics, we have Cubans, we have Puerto Ricans, we have Haitians, we have many, many different groups that are part of the electoral process. And so I think the takeaway and the opportunity to look at local parties is there and very important for us.
Ms. Bradshaw, you have heard what Mr. Eisenberg has said. Would you take the same approach just from the other side, or do you disagree what he says? Is there a different way to do it?
In terms of the way they spend resources, and well, I don't want to give away any state secrets. I have to be careful in front of a reporter talking about what we're up to. I mean, certainly, I think operatives on both sides, professional campaign operatives on both sides of the aisle, are using the type of data that Sasha presented and looking at it in the same way in terms of what it costs to actually turn out a vote in a particular state. How you do that again and where you choose to spend your resources is important. The problem is even Republicans who've had great success at fundraising do not have the dollars to do what Sasha, you know, in a very clinical way spreads out. What does a vote actually cost? And so it's a question of resources and how you allocate those resources. There's a big debate right now, for example, to some of the sessions we had yesterday on how best to use social media and how effective it is. And depending on what type of media vendor you are, you think either television advertising or social media or direct mail has more of a role in campaigns. So what percentage of your budget, for example, if you have a limited budget, is spent on social media versus traditional media? And it's very difficult for me. I'll tell you a funny story. I shared this with, I don't know if Josephine is still here. She may have had to leave, but I shared with someone, one of your participants, that if you're my age, I just switched from a BlackBerry to an iPhone about 6 months ago. And I was like Rip Van Winkle. I woke up and 15 years into the future, the iPhone was doing all these things for me. It was amazing. But I can't completely operate the iPhone. However, my 18-year-old and my 13-year-old stand ready to assist, and in seconds' time, they programmed my phone, so it's just a remarkably helpful device. But I still question, where do we put our resources? My daughter has an Instagram account, and she has a, do you know what a hedgehog is? A hedgehog, you know, and I think they're in African pygmy hedgehogs, and there's some in England. In the United States, you can keep these as pets. She actually has a hedgehog, and she has an Instagram account, and she has 7,000 followers of this hedgehog. Now, how do you take that when she becomes 18 and translate that into voting behavior? Because I think it's certainly in the US, this younger 18 to 29 demographic gets their information in very quick bites. I mean, it has to be very quick. They have no attention span. They look at the picture of the hedgehog, they click on it, they like it, they move to the next picture of the dog or the cat or their friend on vacation at the beach. And I don't even begin to pretend to know how to process that. There are much smarter people than me in our party who look at those. But certainly, back to your question, we use the same data. We may interpret it differently. We may focus our resources in a different way based on what the needs are in that particular election. But it is very relevant data.
Weitere Fragen? Okay. Then I'll have another one. Interesting. Also, just like a footnote in your presentation, but you were talking about candidate recruitment, that it becomes very important. How do you do it as a national party? I mean, those guys you put up there, how do you find them and how do you actually place them? Because I think if we in Berlin decided to pick candidates in the different states, they would tell us to go home, to put it nicely.
Well, that's again.
Because they probably think they have their better candidates. So how do you recruit? How do you find, or how do you form, and do you?
So two things I would say. Frequently, for that reason, to your point, we do it from the ground up. The national committee does not go to the state of Florida and say, we met a really impressive woman who lives in Miami-Dade County, and she owns a business, and she's Catholic, and she's this, and she's that, and we want you to run her for the state legislature or for mayor. But we do rely heavily on state parties who have relationships with people in local communities to find candidates, and then we try to use the national party structures to help provide resourcing and financing for these candidates. We also have the Republican National Committee, but adjacent to, not under, but related to the National Committee are three other parties. The National Republican Senatorial Committee, which recruits candidates to run for the U.S. Senate. The National Republican Congressional Committee, which is involved in recruiting and funding candidates for Congress. And I think a secret weapon of our party is the RSLC, the Republican State Leadership Committee. That committee, that party, doesn't get a lot of attention, doesn't try to generate press articles or coverage. They don't go on television and talk about what they're doing, but they specifically recruit state legislative candidates to begin to build this bench. And they have had incredible success over the last 2 years recruiting women to run for statewide offices like our Secretary of State or Attorney General or other cabinet officers, Lieutenant Governor. They recruit candidates who run for the state legislature. In fact, I just got back from a conference of theirs and was really pleased to know the success they've had working with state parties to recruit from the local level. You cannot recruit from the top down. It's got to be done from the bottom up.
Just to follow up, does recruitment translate into you see someone with potential and then offer them to finance their campaign? Is that recruitment what it means?
So you're basically meeting, that would be the offer. Yeah.
I don't want to be impolite. I'm just like,
no, you're not impolite. I just can think of many candidates who've been recruited and then subsequently I hear grumbling that they were promised some things and then those were not delivered. I think that's true of both parties. Certainly resources, staff, strategy, tactics, those are things that are offered. Frequently, in the case of the RSLC, they will work with the state parties to make sure these candidates are fully funded. We've gotten to the point where we realize if we recruit someone and we convince them to actually give up where they are now, what they're doing now, and commit full-time to a campaign, we have to provide financial resources. And so certainly that would be one of the offerings. It is probably not done to the extent that these candidates would always hope, but it is certainly part of the recruitment process. Yeah.
Sasha, you wanted something?
So, Sally, you started by saying that, at least on some of the mechanical stuff, that the Republican Party did have an advantage that was lost by complacency, and sort of said that it could be a warning to a party like the CDU. And in my reporting, I've sort of seen in 2004 that on a lot of the mechanical stuff, you know, Republicans were ahead, or at least even, and they were evenly matched. What's your understanding of what did go wrong in the years in between in terms of maintaining that advantage? And obviously your party had the White House for 4 years, had control of Congress for 2 of them. What goes on within a party that makes them lose that advantage?
I think, you know, when you're in the majority, you tend to become a little arrogant. I mean, you tend to become a little complacent. And I think that was a real challenge for us. Many articles were written by your peers about how our party led the way. There were even several books written about how we were leading the way on data and targeting. And it is amazing to me, but there was a reporter from Florida who now works, I think, for the Washington Post, who wrote a book about a permanent majority for the Republican Party and how quickly this can change. I mean, it just in the flash of an eye, I mean, just like that, it changed. I have to credit, though, the Obama team, I think, more so than the Democrat National Committee, for really turning things around. They came in with a very collegial approach. And in the context of a campaign, Obama was quite a risk taker. He brought in people who had no political background, had never worked in political campaigns, but he was willing to say, you know about data, you know about how to use consumer data, this is the voter data we have, how do we combine the information and the resources we have to go get these voters? And what Obama did was completely remake the electorate. He turned out people that had never voted before, but who were, based on their demographic background, likely to vote for him. And that's one of the problems that Republican pollsters, I think, had in predicting the reelect, is that they at best underestimated, at worst completely blew the modeling on who was actually going to vote. And this was a real challenge. Obama remade the electorate. And again, he trusted, it's got to be very difficult to do at that level. He trusted his campaign. He trusted the data teams he brought in to produce information and then actually use the data. There are reports of the Romney campaign having similar data, and of some colleagues of ours who are very, very talented going to the higher ups in the Romney campaign and saying, for example, women in Virginia think this. This is a very big problem in the Richmond suburb. To win the state of Virginia, to win Virginia's electoral votes, we immediately need to change the messaging in Richmond to do this. And these people were politely patted on the head and sent back to their basement room to continue to work on data. In other words, you can't just have the data, you have to use the data. And that involves letting go and taking risk, which is probably, it involves change. It's difficult to do. Obama was willing to do it, we were not. So.
One last question.
As a woman and a professional, do you have an explanation how Hillary Clinton lost to President Obama? Because I think a lot of American politics in the last 8 years is that unique personality.
You remember at some point I mentioned the outsized influence of small states in the nominating process. That not only happens on the Republican side, but in the Democrat side. There are states like Iowa and New Hampshire that lead the way. Our first caucus and our first primary are in Iowa and New Hampshire in the presidential campaign. And in both parties, in Iowa, I'm trying to think of a better word for this because I'm not sure how it will translate, but extreme voters in both parties drive that primary process. And so although Hillary Clinton was a woman, Obama was seen as something even bigger and better, as perhaps the first black president, someone who was seen as more liberal to his party in that contest. And there are many other factors. He's an excellent speaker, he's an excellent campaigner. What has served him well on the campaign trail has not always served him well governing, but at the campaign level, there are a few people better. And he began to gain momentum in Iowa, and he won. And it's just a different, a small state having an outsized influence on the process, and then that campaign really started to change. Sasha would be interesting to hear his answer to that as well. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But my sense is that that state made a significant difference in that change.
And then, he maximized the Democratic nominating calendar actually, because of the nature of proportional representation and the delegate allocation, Obama figured out a strategy for maximizing the number of delegates he was going to win in small states. And in retrospect, it looks like malpractice of Hillary's campaign. But there was an idea that you win a primary calendar by basically blowing out your opponent in the beginning, and that you just get a lot of momentum and then they don't raise any more money and it's over after a few states. And it had been 25 years since a Democratic primary had gone through basically all the states. And Hillary's campaign did not envision a scenario where it wouldn't be over within a month. And it turned out once it went beyond a month, Obama was prepared and she wasn't. And that maximizes all of the advantages of infrastructure and data and staff. One of the things that Romney did better than his opponents was he had more money and more time, and he prepared better. And once you got beyond the first month, he was better set up to go into states where he was competing against Rick Santorum, who didn't have any version of that infrastructure.
But that's now a huge challenge for us in 2016. You have Hillary. She is by far and away the front runner on the Democrat side. If she chooses to run, it is unlikely she will have that competition. So she can run a general election race in terms of messaging and ideas from the beginning. We have a cast of characters here, potentially, all of whom are good potential candidates. But they have to run in a primary process that is very costly, starting with states where there is outsized influence of extremes of our party. Iowa, and to a lesser extent New Hampshire, the Nevada caucuses, South Carolina, will all lead the way. And it does make it difficult to nominate someone who can win in a general election. You've also got the novelty of of a Democrat woman, of the first potential woman president. And I have plenty of Republican friends who get, again, emotion matters more than reason to them, and they will be moved by the fact that there is a chance to nominate a woman to be the President of the United States, to elect a woman. So it's a challenge.
So thank you very much, Sally, for the insights. I can tell you it's the worst to be run by women.